Testing 1 2 3 1 2 3 testing 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 1 2 3 testing 1 2 3
Hello,
1 2
hello, hello,
3
hello, hello.
testing
Can you hear me?
testing testing
Can...
1 2 3 1 2 3 testing testing 1 2 3 1 2 3 testing 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 1 2 3.
One, 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 two, three.
Good evening and assalamu alaikum, ladies and gentlemen, our followers on different platforms. Welcome. My name is Ghassan Kahlout, and I'm the director of the Center for Conflict and Humanitarian Studies, which is being held under the title of Sudan in Transition, Charting a Pathway to Renewed Civilian Rule. Our center is an independent center, was established in 2016 in Doha. We aim to produce knowledge in the fields of humanitarian work and conflict studies and to contribute to achieving peace ultimately through organizing events which seek to serve the peace building process based on common grounds. According to the Arab public opinion indicator, there is some sort of a general lack of public satisfaction in Sudan vis-à-vis the state's performance over 67% of people. This was during the transitional period after the Bashir regime was deposed. This was before the October 2021, which was followed by civilian rule departing from the charted path and also the lack of progress in forming a new government, which was expected at the beginning of this year. And this kind of difficulties hindering the transition to civilian rule and a complete peace process which achieves stability and democratization. This kind of solution can be achieved if the Sudanese got together. The Sudan really needs more than any time before working sincerely towards achieving peace for the sake of the country, and maybe a national dialogue is the best way to start this process. Now, in view of what was said and after the center's successful experience in supporting the peace process in Afghanistan, comes this event as part of a series of events, and this will be followed tomorrow by 2 days of events, also to be a national platform and a process by the Sudanese and led by the Sudanese. And we hope that these events will be followed by more interactions between civil society and think tanks and the representatives of the Sudanese people in order to crystallize a joint vision. And it's worth mentioning that leading this process will be left to the Sudanese brothers themselves. Our role in the center is just to facilitate. And today's event is an open public event. Other events may be closed to allow for more opportunity to meet and discuss things away from the glare of public eye. We hope through this event and others to reach a breakthrough in what seems to be the impasse in the process of forming a government and the general transition towards the civilian role. And this, of course, requires the input by all the participants. Ms. Nafisa Hajar, she is the Deputy Chief of the Darfur Lawyers Bar or Association. She will be chairing and moderating this symposium this evening. She has long experience in dispute settlement and conflict studies in order to reach a better understanding and to delve in some detail into the causes of the current situation and to understand the peace process and the peace agreements. And Dr. Sarah Isa will be chairing another session, and she is a member of different institutes. This symposium will have 2 sessions. Each session will take 55 minutes. The first period will be devoted for the panelists to speak from the podium. The second period or session will start at 6:15. We have about 10-minute break between the 2 sessions. The second session will be devoted to questions and answers. This symposium will be live streamed on our social uh, social media platforms. We also have simultaneous interpretation available. You can pose your questions after the after the speakers finish their presentations. Ms. Nafisa, please, the floor is yours. In the name of God, the most merciful, the most compassionate. In the name of God, the most compassionate, the most merciful. Our thanks, first of all, the state of Qatar has always supported us in Sudan to seek for problems, for solutions for our problems. The peace agreement is a good reminder of that. Now they are trying to help us to find some sorts of solutions for our problems. And I must thank, first of all, the Center for Conflict and Humanitarian Studies. We thank them sincerely. And these are thanks from all the Sudanese. For lack of time,
We'll start with Dr. Mohamed Almustafa Yousif. We can barely hear the speaker. If you could let the speaker get closer to the microphone, we'll be thankful. Please, could you let the speaker hold the microphone in her hand? Otherwise, we cannot hear her properly. Please ask the speakers to hold the microphone because the volume is too low. Unfortunately, the interpreters cannot hear the speaker because the volume is too low. Could you ask the lady to hold the microphone, please? Because we cannot hear what she's saying. A very good evening to you. It gives me great pleasure to participate in this meeting, and I would like to thank those in charge of this symposium. I would like to thank the Center for attaching importance to the Sudanese dossier, and I would like to thank you, ladies and gentlemen, who are present in this hall. I would like also to thank Dr. Bakri, the coordinator of this symposium. I think that if we are to describe the crisis in Sudan, we must be accurate in order to press ahead with a conversation that we hope that it will be meaningful. Here we are talking about a crisis in Sudan. It is a comprehensive crisis, and to this end, in order for us to make progress and to converse and to illustrate the positions with the aim of finding a solution, we would like to allude to the fact that nowadays the people of Sudan are recognizing that there is a crisis. Some think that there is no crisis or thought so, and some thought that the crisis is not that ominous, and some think that this crisis is transient. But nowadays, I think the silver lining is the recognition that the crisis is deep, protracted, and it might lead to worse scenarios. Also, we need to understand that plumbing the depth of the crisis must be linked to understanding the crisis itself, and we must think seriously of addressing such a crisis. And the path towards the solving of the crisis is the fact that the path is a bit blurry, and as we know, the crisis is very dangerous. We must freely liaise with each other and think of putting a solution into place, and freedom necessitates thinking outside of the box. We must think creatively, otherwise we'll be delving into a vicious circle and the old way of thinking that has been useless. The third issue is as follows. If we adopted the dialogue as a fundamental approach to address the crisis, we must also agree that this dialogue ought to be consensual and reconciliatory, using the force of the majority or the minority, or being resourceful, or so on and so forth. These kind of methods are absurd, are useless. We must accommodate each other. We must reach a consensus, and if we agree on such issues, we also must understand the root causes of our crisis in the government, and I think the main issue is the continuous lack of a national consensual program. There was also a national program. People used to say there was no national program, but there is a national program, but it was not reached or set up consensually. And there are efforts that have been deployed to belittle any attempt to shed light on the importance of having a national program that is consensual, that is based on consensus. Following the independence, the main task of the government, of the state of the Sudan following the colonization was to do with building a nation. However, this ought to have been linked with understanding the characteristics of the Sudan, because if you want to build a house, you need to understand the ingredients that you ought to purchase in order to build the house, the sand and the blocks and the iron and all the rest of it. So we need to understand the nitty-gritty of the history of the Sudan in order to press ahead and find a solution. And we do understand that the Sudan, within its political borders in the north and in the south, 100 million square meters has been formed coercively following a military operation. It was subject to education, to occupation rather, since the Ottomans and also under the British rule. So Sudan was not created by the Lord and the Almighty within these borders, but these borders were man-made following a military operation and occupation. There was also certain settlements that have been reached amongst the infighting parties by the British, the Turks, the Egyptian, France, Ethiopians. They have reached a solution in order to demarcate the borders. So what I would like to say is that the human resources and the borders that have been demarcated were demarcated kind of arbitrarily following the occupation and away from the volition and will of the Sudanese people, and this is a fact and not a myth. And this has been kind of exacerbated by the huge broadness of Sudan and the multiplicity of ethnicities, as well as the backwardness in some areas as regards the communication channels, and this had led to certain isolation of some provinces and thus the plurality, ethnic plurality, environmental plurality, religious, cultural, and otherwise. And this is being a fact, especially when it comes to the yawning gap between the development and the interest of these provinces if we compare them to each other. So in order to have a national consensual program, we must at least work to reach a consensus between these communities. And this can happen only when we are aware of the issues pertinent to Sudan. So we ought to reach a consensus, and they must be part and parcel of Sudan. And this is very important because this cements the unity of the land and diffuses the tension between different communities, and otherwise disintegration will be afoot, and separation and secessionist kind of militias and so on and so forth. In the past we had the southerners, and then we might be talking about the self-determination in certain areas.
We can't hear the lady, unfortunately, in the translation booth. The level is very weak. Yes, our main problem, as I have previously alluded to, we have a conceptual problem, and part of the problem is the lack of a national project. This is probably the root cause of all our problems. We have a national project, maybe, but it's not agreed on. It's not the subject of national consensus. People of the country, Sudanese people, should accept the fact that they are Sudanese, they live in the Sudan, they shouldn't have the desire to depart from it and leave it like our brothers in the South Sudan have done. The second source for this tension is the national project should be comprehensive and based on the identity of the Sudanese state. Right from right from the start, immediately after independence, it was announced that the Sudan was an Arab country. What about the non-Arab citizens population? What should they do? Should they turn themselves into Arabs? It's very important to do things on the basis of national consensus in determining the national identity. It's impossible for the Sudan to be an Arab country because there are so many people, and statistics witness to that, that there may be the vast majority of Sudanese people have non-Arab origin, so we cannot be consider them as Arabs, and this will be an important element of the national project, which will be the basis for establishing the identity of the country, that people should agree on that the Sudan is a multicultural, multi-ethnic, multi-religious. There is a multiplicity of different sub-identities which form the national identity. All of them interact within the crucible of one country, and maybe later on a national identity can be determined. But right from 1956, immediately it was determined that the Sudan was an Arab country. Of course, there are many things should be done to correct this defect first. The third element is monopolizing the political authority. It's needless to say that the national authority or the government should manage the country, its resources, on the basis of right and justice, and ultimately the result we see now and the difference between a national project which is agreed on and one which is not, we'll see that the elites in the center have a total monopoly on power, on authority, on sovereignty, whereas the essence of the matter and should the sovereignty should be to the people. The rule should be that of the people, and the people should be the ones who would give up some of their powers and authorities to the center for certain to serve certain purposes. For this reason, any new national project should take into consideration a, a system of government which is not central. There should be an evolution of of powers, and the peripheries should also be given powers, and there should be coordination. We should have one national army to protect the borders, one national unified currency, and even the Europeans, after centuries of division and wars, agreed on the euro. Also, matters to do with nationality, immigration, international relations, investigating crimes and criminal law, uh, issues to do with public health, for example. Sometimes one disease spreads in one province and then on to the rest of the country, then it becomes a national issue. And also, provinces should have a share of their own resources. And this can rid us of the evil of military coups. For example, any entity which does not have the the authority and the resources, because Khartoum, the capital, honest known, does not have anything. So maybe people go to the provinces and have military coups there. The result of all of this is the feeling, the general feeling that people do not have any say, any power. They're totally marginalized. They cannot decide for themselves. For example, when, for example, does the Minister of Health have any intention or the ability to decide? Because normally in small remote villages, people there, they cannot build even a little clinic without the approval of the ministry in Khartoum. So, and if he or she or the ministry doesn't do anything, they will suffer. Of course, the resultant of all of these conditions will be defects in the developmental process, and the central authorities resorting to violence whenever the people in the peripheries call for their rights to be restored. These are just claims. We said that now all the marginalized, so-called marginalized provinces started with claims to restore their rights, their legitimate rights. Even in the Darfur area, they started without any arms. They didn't have a knife, let alone a gun. In the Nuba, Al-Funj, in the bigger area, all these movements by peasants and workers, they had some right demands, legitimate demands. But what happened is the state faced them with violence, ideological violence and physical violence. In Fosti, some 240 people, farmers, fed peasants, were killed in one night because they simply called for their demands. So therefore, I think the 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 project that is not the subject of national consensus should be abolished and demolished because nobody agrees on it. The only thing it has produced is more violence, wars, and strife. So we must get together to build a regime, a system that can guarantee a sustainable liberties, democracy, development. Thank you very much, Doctor. Thank you. We went a little bit over the time allocated to us, but we give the floor to Ms. Hala Al-Karim. She is a writer, an activist, and a defender of human rights. Whatever I can say about her will not do her any justice, so I will not take too much of your time. Hala will be talking to us about the civil wars and the lack of a national project and how the political elites have dealt with issues to do with war and peace and the interference by the security forces in politics and the economy. I think the country is probably on the verge of total disaster or chaos, according to some analyses. And in the absence of a national project, we are facing a long, dark tunnel. Maybe our fate will be similar to that of the Somalia with all the wars, or the Sudan can go back to its origins, like Dr. Mahmoud Almustafa has said, that the Sudan was different groups put together to form the state of Sudan. We want to know what is the impact of the absence of this national project, and will it or will it not lead to the collapse of the state as some fear? Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Thank you, Nafisa. Long live our martyrs of our revolution, and our prayers to the injured, and our sincere thanks to the Center for Conflict Studies and Humanitarian Work, to Dr. Ghassan in particular for their kind invitation and welcoming us in this wonderful country. I would first of all also like to thank the center for allowing us this space, and also giving us, the Sudanese women, this space to express our positions, which is only compatible to the huge efforts we make and the huge sacrifices we make. What I will say will not be that different than what Dr. Mohamed Yousif has said, but I will just read from my text to be more specific. Since 1955, the Sudan suffered from a correlation of failures by the regimes and military coups for more than 60 or 65 years could not come up with a vision or a perception for the Sudanese state that we inherited from the colonial powers and the independence of the South Sudan, and the failure to deal with our crises was the biggest blow to the Sudanese state and exposed the accumulation of crises and also the cessation of the unified state, and having two Sudans now is testimony to the lack of vision by the military elites and the civilian elites both. And this constitutes part of the basic question: who are the Sudanese? And the Sudan we look at, where is it heading, and what possible consequences should we expect? Audre Lorde is a feminist in Africa. She wrote a famous article in critiquing the relations with the state, and said you cannot dismantle the master house using the same master's tools. What I want to say here is in 1955, in December, when the rule of Sudan was handed over to the Sudanese elite, their ambitions from that day until now was to get their hands on the house of the master and to impersonate the master. They never tried to build a house for the Sudanese or even repair the house of the master gradually so that it can eventually become a house that belongs to the Sudanese. We are still using the same methodology of the colonial powers. The difference is at least the colonial powers had their own clear vision, which was different that of our national weapon, national project, despite the aborted attempts by some like people like Abdul Khaliq Mahjoub and his project to liberate from the colonial powers, Garang's project to build a new Sudan, and some of the projects associated with Jafar Numeri in the early days of his rules to establish a national institution. By and large, most of the work by the political elite remained within the realm of trying or attempting to, to seize the house of the master. There was no social contract whereby Sudanese people can develop their narrative and develop policies which are compatible to the diversity in the make of the country and achieve something by way of peace, stability, and democracy. The political Islamists under the National Congress in the Sudan has also promoted the idea of violence for achieving the national project, and therefore the efforts by political parties and political institutions was reduced to a bare minimum of fighting over authority, and the Islamist regime left a series of massacres in the Darfur and the Blue Nile, and also led to the disfigurement of the state and fragmentation of the country, and we lost a lot in the economy, development, education, and health services, and we lost our standing in the world. We suffered from isolation and alienation, and many Sudanese had to leave the country and seek for a dignified living abroad. This is the question of migration now outside the country. The glorious October Revolution has provided a wonderful opportunity to break this historical vicious circle and to avail themselves of the opportunity to build a new national consensus or national project and continue the path towards democratization. On the one hand, neither the political parties nor the civil society were prepared for this task, in my estimation, because neither of them received the sufficient support from other quarters, whether regional or international. I think there was no investment in the Sudanese political structure or environment. The second aspect of this is all political entities in that period were eager to reach power and gain power in a way which was really vicious and at a time when the political system was not willing to give up power for as long as they could continue in having their hands tightly gripped on the country. They have the military power, they have the resources, everything, and they were totally blinded to the fact that popularly they were rejected, and the military militias and others were interfering in trading illegally and money laundering, illegally trading in gold and other minerals. All of these factors gave them the impression that th- that they can continue ruling, and also gave the other side the delusion or illusion that they can replace them and rule. In fact, we as Sudanese can create an impact, can make a change of, of things. This is not a dream born in a vacuum. I think Al Bayturi, the famous Sudanese uh, poet, said something to the effect that those who cannot see clearly miss what they have, basically. The Sudanese people, with all their different entities, we are in agreement that the military establishment has failed in building a country or ruling the country, and we are also in agreement that there should be a civilian democratic rule able to lead a diverse Sudan. But the devil lies in the details, and here I must underline the word democracy, because democracy has its own dues that should be given. We have to be serious, we have to accept the others who are different to us, and we should accept to collaborate and cooperate with them. Dr. Mohamed Yousif said a country so diverse or so complex like the Sudan, you cannot talk about any political project without providing the means and ways and mechanisms to allow for everybody to be part of this political process. And there's no doubt that the sacrifices made until now since the coup have been great sacrifices, and the Sudanese people's demands throughout the country and their readiness to make all these sacrifices in order to reach a civilian democratic rule which can lead to stability, they are not just unrealistic demands, they are sincere aspirations and legitimate claims and the result of deep knowledge and experiences of the defects in the military establishment, which can only push the country towards more fragmentation. But unfortunately, the opposition does not have a cohesive political discourse or a vision for the mechanisms of effecting this change, and I underline the word mechanisms. And despite having very important tools for resisting the regime, but the political discourse remains very limited, especially when it is trying to stand up to the structure of the current military coup. This structure, this military structure in power, does not have any vision about laying down any bridge. Miss Hala.
As far as the interference of the military in the socio-political life relates perhaps to the civilians themselves or the political forces, because the political parties in Sudan, if they are weak or fragile, when they are not in power, they liaise with the military in order to stage a coup d'etat. So the civilians have links with the coup d'etat. And even the emergence of the military in the constitutional declaration and the participation in the transitional period and taking the helm of power, they were pushed by the civilians themselves. Thank you, Nafisa. I'll answer a question, but there is one important point that I'm tackling here. 65% of the Sudanese are below 30, including children or youngsters below 18. 85% of the youngsters live below the poverty line. I think that there is a historical and ethical duty ought to be shouldered by the Sudanese politicians vis-à-vis these youngsters. We cannot push our children towards destitution. So this is one point. The Sudanese have refused the coup, but as I said, the devil lies in the details. And there is another point that relates to the role that might be carried out by the regional powers and the international community. If we carry out our homework and shouldered our responsibility in order to be up to the standards and live to the occasion, especially when it comes to our rhetoric, to our discourse. Indeed, since the 90s, there was an important Western project as far as the South Sudan is concerned. The Southern Sudanese have suffered greatly because of the carnage and the massacres, the chaos of the Sudanese government. However, I think that the international community and the international order and the regional power will not allow to have a ruling system that is based on illicit flow of money, evasion of taxes, and so on and so forth, because we need to be transparent. We need to have political institutions that are subject to accountability, especially internationally. You cannot loot the Sudanese and levy certain taxes, and at the same time you are complicit of corruption and smuggling metal and gold abroad. So I think that if we have a discourse that is splendid, and if this discourse is up to the standards, then we might be more respected by the international community. But the question is, how can we develop faithful kind of mechanisms to analyze the reality, or how can we chart a course to arrive at a democratic civilian rule? The strategy that has been adopted nowadays is a strategy towards power, and it is illegitimate. We have documents, initiatives on the part of desperate kind of powers, or agreements on disintegrating the country, dividing the country, and I think these initiatives are doomed to fail, because we have signed numerous peace agreements since 1955, and no initiative has been successful. They have added insult to injury because they are illegitimate, and these initiatives were not part and parcel of a political process. If we want to survive away from this chaos and the hegemony of the military and the former regime, we must attach priority to a genuine peace process and a roadmap in order to address the issue of the military and how they can exit the scene in Sudan and arrive at a civilian government. Thus, we can gain confidence and have a national vision to cement the democracy. In conclusion, Jones Nyerere, the Tanzanian master, has said there is no time to waste. We must either unite now or perish. There is no time to waste. We must either unite today or perish. Thank you. Thank you. Now we'll open the floor to you, ladies and gentlemen, to pose your questions, commentary. We'll start with 3 questions. Mr. Al-Walid, please. Microphone, please. We cannot hear the gentleman. The nation state in Europe had a high level of coercion. The nation state has been violent. There were persuasive measures deployed, but in the past, some countries resorted to coercive measures, and I do understand where you're coming from, but what is annoying from my own perspective is the following. If we don't have a central planning authority, and if we don't have a central planning efforts, then things will be chaotic, and we might lose the provinces because they lack the basic institutional capabilities. We were enthusiastic when it comes to this issue. However, when it comes to examine it, there will be no capacity, we discover. And if there is no central planning, then we will be losing these resources. For Sudan to revive, you must have water from the Nile, and the Western Sudan ought to be open to the belt of Sudan. This happens if we connected to Abshir and other kind of cities by rail. Thank you. Mu'tasim al-Amir, a legal advisor. I think that the problem of Sudan is deep-rooted. It has been created by the colonizing powers, Tagali in the Nuba and other tribes in Kordofan and Darfur and so on and so forth. So Sudan has been composed of tribes, and following the independence, these components or these tribes were not channeled into becoming a melting pot. So I think the issue is nothing to do with the regime. It is to do with the state itself. The education in Sudan does not serve diversity. This is my father has worn a garment, and my mother did so, and so on and so forth. And we have certain details that emphasize provincialism, and the problem in Sudan can be summarized in 2 words: diversity and respect. We have difference in the ideology, in the thought, in the composition, but we don't have respect. There is also a difference between the Sudanese Congress, the Communist Party, and the Change and Democracy forces. So I think that the state must take into consideration diversity in our schools. We must also instill respect of different races, different ethnicities, and different religions in the heads of our children. And in Sudan, why do we cement the concept of Arabism race-wise? There is a problem here. If we look at the Arabs in Quraysh, they are Arabists rather than the Arabs themselves. The Arabs were in Medina, the Khazraj tribe and the Aus tribe. And there are some Arab countries that do not speak in Arabic. So why we are adamant on this Arabism racial kind of profiling? I think the Arab Islamic concept has harmed the diversity and the development, and we perhaps must broaden this concept. Arabism is to do with speaking Arabic rather than being an Arab. Thank you. Dr. Nada? Just 1 minute each, please, if you don't mind. Microphone is not working. We can barely hear the lady, but the lady is thanking the panelists. I have 2 questions addressed to both. Following what my colleague has said, the biggest mistake in history is not learning from history. Our problem is to do with not tapping into the lessons of history. And the history of Sudan has not been documented properly. Even the history of the modern history of Sudan, because the victorious elite has written our history. So we couldn't kind of rectify the mistakes. Nowadays, the Sudanese are trying to rectify certain mistakes for the sake of the future generations. So how can we avoid these mistakes. The second question is to Mrs. Hala. There is a narrative that says that there is a confusion when it comes to the position of the international community vis-à-vis Sudan. And thus, there is no kind of firm position on the part of different powers, especially in America and the EU. Perhaps Russia only has a firm stance. So, the regional powers also think that stability in Sudan will not serve them. Most of the alliances regionally are thinking of such propensity. Thank you. Another two perhaps questions. Thank you. My name is Hanadi. I'm here a student. I would like to add and say my question is to Hala. There are some powers that have interest in Sudan. Some Sudanese were recruited to fight in Yemen, and some have investments in Port Sudan. And through the Khartoum process, the international community supported the rapid support forces, and the Volkers initiative is being implemented in Sudan through the military. So what is your expectations? Last intervention. Thank you. I'd like to thank Dr. Ghassan Al-Kahlout, the head of the center who is hosting us. Engineer Khalid Umar delivered a speech here, and Mr. Sheltout said that he'll be organizing a different symposium, and he did. So we hope that this will be repeated. And Qatar is famous of being an intermediary, especially when it comes to 1995 Sudan and Eritrea reconciliation, and the Darfur reconciliation process, Lebanon and Libya, Chad and Afghanistan. The longest USA war. So we hope that you would recommend that the research platform that has instigated such symposia will turn into a platform that is sponsored by the state of Qatar, because Qatar is an honest broker, especially when the military has committed a mistake as far as hosting the officials in Qatar, which was kind of lackluster. I think the crisis in Sudan has started following the coup by the Islamists, and there was the crisis that was cemented by the 25th of October, covered by Israel and the Mossad, the coup, the military coup. So the interventions in Sudan are positive and negative. How can we salute a coup covered by Israel? And for the first time, the speaker at the UNGA representing the Sudan has dismissed mentioning even Palestine. The item number 17 of the resolution 2025-54 is very important. We have been put on under sanctions, and my question is how can we turn the initiatives into benign initiatives that might help the Sudanese? Thank you. We'll answer the following questions. 3 minutes, please. Thank you for your observations and questions. In answering Dr. Al-Walid, yes, his observation is right, 100% correct. And the modern history of Europe shows a chain of violence and war between the tribes. If you go back to the history of Europe, because they were living in the same geography, and there was a fierce struggle that has led to a nation state created by one of the big tribes in Europe. We had the nation state before on the part of the Ottomans, the British and the Egyptians, and they demarcated our borders. A state that is sovereign over its borders. But what we need is a nation, a unified nation. I think this must have been the core of the progressive project of Sudan, because when the British left, they left a number of problems, hatred, people living in silos, provinces disintegrated and far away from each other. I think that we need to have a nation that is unified, and the Sudanese must reach a consensus, rather than arriving at this objective by force. We cannot resort to ethnic cleansing. And this is inadmissible. So this is out of the question. So hopefully we will arrive at a unified nation. I think our project has failed because it depended on two tools, a robber kind of any Sudanese who is different, then he will be erased. So an Islamist will be erased, another will be erased. So the experience has shown that this project has failed, and these two tools have been used: the eraser and the scissor. It is unacceptable to erase the presence of the other, and it is not acceptable to kind of carve out one part of the Sudan. Yes, okay, the South Sudan is an independent country now, but what is the interest thereby? I think that we must build our nation. And this takes place only through dialogue and through reconciliation. The open, transparent dialogue that is respectful of all. When it comes to the Constitutional Congress, yes, that was the main demand, so that we can address the core issues. And here I need to differentiate between the root causes of the crisis and the symptoms. The symptoms is the like of the military coup, d'etat, poverty, and so on. And these might be addressed with different methods and due diligence, but the root causes that relates to the identity, the decentralized rule, and including the relation between religion and the state. These are the root causes of the problem. We must address these issues through persuasion rather than force. No one has the right to use force. Neither majority. However, thank you. Hala. 3 minutes, please. Thank you. As far as the international community is concerned, the confusion, that is your question, Nada, and your question also is similar. The non-objective kind of expectations of the international community. We think that the international community should provide us with limitless support continuously. I think that the confusion that took place as regards the international community's position is related to our own position as Sudanese, because we, up to this moment, swing between bellicose, hostile kind of discourse against the international community, albeit we are part and parcel of the international community through our economy and our daily life, because we are a very poor country, and our people are being dispossessed of the riches of their resources. So this is the way lives is shaped, because the Sudanese depend on the remittance of the diaspora of the Sudanese abroad, or some Sudanese who work in different NGOs, in companies, and so on and so forth. But the structure of the state itself is very difficult to be detached from the international community. The issue that relates to the confusion of the international community is to do with the lack of our own discourse, the Sudanese discourse that is clear. We think of the support per se, and this is the room that we might maneuver through. The issue of the foreign interference in Sudan is very well known. No one disputes that. However, we have lost the sovereignty of the state of Sudan, and we have turned into a proxy state, and consequently we do not blame the interfering countries. We should blame ourselves. We should blame our political institutions that have allowed the militarization and the recruitment of the citizens and the limbo that Sudan is living through. However, nevertheless, we are part and parcel of an international system, the international community, and we are part and parcel of our region, Africa, and we are part and parcel of the League of Arab States and the world. And we have our own commitments, and on numerous occasions we have not met such obligations, and we must confess if we are hostile towards the international community, then we will be similar to the former regime. We will be isolated, and things will be more ominous and more difficult, and this will never serve us positively. We must have a coherent discourse that takes into consideration our own interests and our national sovereignty. But up to this moment, we don't have this balanced discourse vis-à-vis the international community. We have divided unclear, ambiguous discourse. This is our own problem. This makes the position of the international community is ambiguous as well. Thank you. Three seconds. How could I speak in 3 seconds? This is unrealistic. I would like to thank the panelists, the organizers. We've heard about the root causes of the problem, but you haven't talked about the solution. And how could you link the solution with the title of this Symposium, Charting a Pathway to Renewed Civilian Rule. Okay. The reality is there, and the authoritarian regimes have destroyed the civil society, and the parties, and we do understand that because the parties have been divided, destroyed by the authoritarian regimes. So how could you comment on the solution, and how could you link it with the title? And also we can add to this the interference. So what's the solution? We'll be answering this question during the next session. Thank you. I would like to thank the center. I would like to thank all those who have deployed efforts in organizing this symposium. We'll have 5 minutes break, 5-minute break, and then we'll come back.